All right, well, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Mark Skidmore. You're one of the few people that I feel like I could have a good conversation with about a topic that I think is very important that very few people know about, which is the subject of the missing trillions. So, to begin with, you're a professor of economics at Michigan State University. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what your specialization is in economics and how that made you well suited to research this issue once you discovered about it, and we'll talk about that too.
Sure. Well, to begin, I was trying to before we start, maybe we could just chat for a few minutes because you have a
Sure.
very interesting background. I
Yeah.
was I was trying to catch a little bit about your background, but you recently wrote a book, is that right?
Yeah, I wrote a book that was a long time coming. It was originally based out of a series that I did on my Substack, and it's called The Coming World Nation. And I do cite you in this book, along with your work you did with Cass and Austin Fitts, in a section called The Missing Trillions. But I have a unique angle on the topic of what this issue suggests, which I think is a like Cass and Austin Fitts. I see a parallel governance structure, but I define it differently than how she does. But that's something I've been tracking for about 10 years. And yeah, I started following Captain Austin Fitts in around 2015, 2014. And her and Joseph P. Farrell, you probably are familiar with, but he's someone else who delves into this world. But I got into this through a study of, well, it's kind of a longer story, but my background's in sociology or the social sciences. And so when I got out of grad school, this was circa Occupy Wall Street era. I
Yeah.
got really interested in trying to figure out the real story about how the economy works, because that was a time when it was obvious that the overt story of how the economy functions and the reality they don't mesh. So that kind of just opened up a door where I used my background in the social sciences, and particularly I was interested in using system science applied to sociology. So I started to try to analyze, like, if we were to model our society as a system, how does our financial system fit into that? And so that opened up a long research process where I eventually concluded that what we're looking at is a system of empire, and that the economy is an aspect of this empire, and that you can only understand the way the economic system works if you understand the geopolitical environment of it. And so that study ended up becoming this book, The Coming World Nation, which shows how the rise of this empire formed, and then how the scientific age and the rise of technologies has transformed that empire into something that resembles what Catherine Fitz calls the breakaway civilization. So again, I analyze it a little bit differently. We can get into that,
Yeah.
but that's how I got into researching this subject. And it's something that there's very few people who are at the level where they're looking at what, like, the research that you've done on this topic. There's very few people that are even aware of this world and looking at things
Right.
at this paradigm, because it's really a different
Right.
paradigm of looking at the way society works. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to you today about your impressions of this research and
Yeah.
what it suggests.
I so thanks for the intro. I appreciate that. And I
Hmm.
would say that, your the way you briefly described your model of the world. Everybody has a model of the world, and we organize our lives around because the things are so complex that we try to create a system, like you described, a system that explains things. And then if there's an anomaly, if it doesn't fit into our model, we just sort of dismiss it.
Hmm.
And so if your model is way off, there's all these anomalies that you just think, oh, that was kind of weird, and you ignore
Hmm.
it. But if you have a better map or a better model, then those anomalies are really important, and and they're signals that things are happening. So anyway,
Hmm.
one last question,
Sure.
maybe before we get started, but how does the whole COVID thing work into your framework? I know that's a
Well,
big question.
yeah. I mean, that was there's different levels of it. I mean, I would say on the most obvious level, to me, that was a social engineering operation that had financial aspects to it. It had basically, for me, that was part of a planned move to set up global technocracy, uh, and to lay the grassroots of that. Now, there's more to it than that. I mean, there's a heavy psychological component. There's a lot of archetypes that seem to have been activated at that time to help drive some of the mania around what happened. So I don't think you can look at it only at the level of a conspiracy, but I do feel that it was the product of one, and you can look at a lot of different elements that point to that. So, the end result of it was that it there, it really showed that nation states at this point are very much integrated and almost subservient to an international governing body. And this was like a trial for how that expresses itself. It was like a test run for how to globally coordinate the world in a time of crisis, or even if it's a manufactured crisis. And I think we can expect something in the future that will parallel that. It might not be a health crisis, but it'll be something where this international network of NGOs and governance institutions activates and organizes things. Because I do think the long-term trend is globalization, global government, and technocracy replacing capitalism.
Yeah, that's the desire, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you that it, I mean, even today, not a single country has banned the COVID shot despite all the evidence of its harm.
Yeah, I mean, all the feedback loops have broken down as far as science, as far as governance and regulation. So nothing is operating as it's supposed to. And I feel like the breakdown is kind of signifying that there's this, I think the easiest way to describe it is an empire that is, its characteristic is that it operates secretly. In the rise of this empire, it didn't dismantle the overt nation states and their overt governments and the system of checks and balances that are designed to work a certain way. It didn't dismantle them. It just kind of moved in and corrupted them, and it hides itself from within them. So the secrecy is very important, and the root of the secrecy, I think, is the hidden technology, which Catherine Fitz talks about, that they're protecting a totally different paradigm of science and technology, and have been for probably 100 years at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers, isn't it?
But
So
yeah, I'm
I'm glad to have this
yeah,
conversation with you, but you just put a lot out there, but I have to say that I generally agree with your overall assessment. So I don't think we're gonna talk past each other.
yeah, I agree.
So,
Well, so
all
I'm
right.
interested with, as an professor of economics, what was your specialization coming into, I think 2016, when you first started working with Catherine Fitz, or around then, and so what made you well suited to be able to actually take a claim and then research it and find out if it's actually true by going into the actual accounting records?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of economics. I hold an endowed chair in state and local government finance and policy. So I'm accustomed to reading public budgets. I have core understanding of accounting. And and so I had never really applied it to federal government financial statements, or really spent a lot of detail reading them. I just looked immediately to the overall assessments that you can see the but when you look at the underlying books, a different story emerges. So I had applied most of my knowledge to local and state government.
Hmm.
And so you have all this information. And if a local government falls into financial trouble, there's some oversight. And it's
Hmm.
usually the state government, right? And so if there's a problem, the state government will intervene. They'll look at it because the local government is, underneath the umbrella of the state,
Hmm.
and the state will intervene and they'll do what they need to do. They might declare bankruptcy, they might reformat things, redesign, restructure, but eventually it gets fixed. If there's corruption or if there's just poor decision making, it it gets fixed.
Hmm.
With the United States federal government, it it polices, it monitors itself.
Hmm.
And I think what Catherine Austin Fitts, having had this experience, understood that this governance structure that you talked about is beyond the federal government. And for some reason, these kinds of anomalies just sort of go unnoticed. Usually, when Catherine talks about these unaccountable transactions, and then I stepped into it. But the whole idea is that there should be some oversight and some structure to fix problems as they emerge. And the kinds of things that Catherine was highlighting and then that I became involved in are things that don't get fixed.
Hmm.
There are these huge accounting discrepancies in the trillions of dollars, and people will just say, well, I guess we're just not very competent. We're not able to fix it. Um,
Right.
we can have sophisticated technology, organizational structure, but we're really incompetent at tracking where the money goes.
Hmm.
And I don't buy that. I don't
Right.
think it's an accident.
Yeah, I mean the competence is at a level of I do think there are like scapegoats put into place at a certain level. Are there like a lower level operative people who actually implement some of the systems? But what we're it's so systematic, the fraud, that it's clear. And actually the what's going on in Minnesota might be a good example of this at a smaller scale than what we're talking about with what you uncovered. But yeah, it seems that there's a clearly a system in place once you lay out the full data set. But the problem is almost no one really lays out the full data set. They are prone to take little pieces of that data set and dismiss them as anomalies as they pop up here and there, as you were
And it
saying.
is really anomalous, for example, I have had numerous grants with the federal government over many years. And when I spend money, I have to justify it.
Hmm.
It has to be for the purposes described in the grant, and I have to have receipts. So you're used to a high level, at least in my experience, a high level of competence and tracking, and the money does not get dispersed unless you can demonstrate that you're actually using the money for what you said you would use it for.
Hmm.
And so with all of the stuff that we looked at within the Department of Defense, there's just massive hundreds of billions of dollars of accounting adjustments with no explanation whatsoever. And so people say, well, we're not very good at it. We shrug our shoulders and we
Hmm.
move on, and it just sort of disappears. But there's more to the story than that, I
Yeah, I mean that's the exact attitude you would need, that kind of
think.
shrugging, in order to systematically conceal a hidden financial network, which is what it seems to be here. But as far as your awareness of this particular topic of trillions of dollars in accounting fraud taking place, is was this something that you were aware of before you had heard Catherine Fitts talk about it? And just so everybody knows, Catherine Fitts was a former Wall Street insider and also worked in the Bush administration, and so she's in a position to find out things like this. And so was she kind of the whistleblower that turned you onto this? And then if I recall, were you able to mobilize some of your students at MSU and delve into the actual records and verify this?
Yeah, before I answer your question, I want to back up for a minute because
Sure.
prior to about 2000, between 2010 and 2015, I had no idea that any of these kinds of discrepancy existed. I didn't think to look at those kinds of issues very deeply. And then something happened that really altered the the way I think about things. And that was the great financial crisis,
Hmm.
and when the whole financial system really almost failed. And something happened within a 2 week period that just shocked me because we began to understand that the reason for the crisis was the massive fraud that was occurring in the housing market and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eric Holder, the Department of Justice chief, made a big announcement. He said, we know that there's massive fraud, but we're not going to prosecute anyone. These entities are too big to fail. If we do that, the whole thing will come unraveled, which I knew was
Mm-hmm.
not true.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, wow, nobody? And really, nobody was ever prosecuted.
No.
And then maybe a week later, the Department of Treasury chief, Hank Paulson, came on TV and said, we have a major problem. We have to give trillions of dollars to the financial institution that committed the fraud in order to preserve the system. Otherwise, we'll all go under. And I didn't believe that was true either. So not only are we not going to prosecute or punish any of the crimes, we're going to reward the people who cause the problems by issuing trillions of dollars of money.
Mm-hmm.
And that just is like, okay, however I thought the world worked, whatever my model of the world was, I wasn't explaining that. So I said, I
Right.
think I have to go back to the drawing board. And that's when I started looking for just other competent people who had something to say about some of these things. And that's when I ran into some of Catherine Austin Fitts' work. And I was just listening to an interview, and she made a statement that in fiscal year 2015, the report came out in 2016 for the DOD, specifically the Army, in which in a single year, the Army had acknowledged through an OIG report, the Office of the Inspector General, that it could not account for $6.2 trillion in transactions. So having some background in looking at local government and finances and state level, it's like, there's no way that these accounting discrepancies should be multiples of the entire budget. If you had, say, a $500 billion budget for the Army or a $200 billion budget, it'd only be a small fraction. How could it be multiples?
Mm-hmm.
So I at first I thought she had made a mistake. It couldn't be, 6.2 trillion, maybe 6.2 billion. And even then, that would be a huge sum to lose track of. And so I found the report myself, and I just started looking at it. It's just all kinds of strange examples of transactions that couldn't be accounted for. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just started asking questions. And then Catherine and I were in touch with one another, and we said, let's try to systematically look over the years for all of these reports that exist and just sum them up and tally them and see what we can learn. And, so they typically don't produce a report like this every year for the Army or every year for the Navy, et cetera. They only do them every once in a while. So we tallied them all up for the DoD as well as Housing and Urban Development. And we found from official government sources $21 trillion in transactions for which there were no clear explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just asked the question, and it happened at that time back in 2016, 17, 18. The total debt was about 21 trillion. So it just got a lot of exposure in the media, like, wow. So in that sense, I think people started to ask questions and it got a little bit of attention, which I think is good. But the challenge is that the federal government, rather than addressing it, on the one side, they said they were going to address the challenge, and they said we're going to conduct our first official external audit of the DoD ever. And after it completed that, it did not pass the audit and has not since. So it's been about 8 years of not passing an audit. But after before they produced the findings of the first audit, the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board was approached and they asked for some guidance. And so this is what they did effective 2018. Rather than address the challenges, they said, what we want to be able to do because of national security issues, as we report on the findings of the federal government financial statements, et cetera, particularly for the DoD, there are some national security issues that might emerge as a problem. So the Federal Accounting Advisory Board, Standards Advisory Board, FASAB, said, we recommend that 2 sets of books be issued. There will be an actual book, set of financial statements available to a small group of people, and we don't know who really knows what that is. And then a second set for the public and for others that has been modified.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't know to what degree the modifications occurred, and we don't know whether they've been even modified at all. And just said we have a financial statement that we're going to put out there. It's been tweaked, and furthermore, we give ourselves the authority to move things around and change things within all federal agencies. So since about 2018, I don't really look or put much weight in the financial statements because they told us that they're going to report or make financial statements that are available that have been modified, and we have no way of knowing to what degree they've been modified.
Right.
And ever since then, the Office of the Inspector General produces reports like the ones that we cited, but they don't ever put any figures in there. So they just say we have some accounting problems, etc., but they don't actually report any of the numbers. And then the financial statements that actually come out, we don't know for sure to what degree they've been modified. And that's
So
where we
basically,
stand today. And that was done in the first Trump administration.
yeah, but it's done at a level of the bureaucracy. Like it's the permanent bureaucracy that,
Yeah,
like you said, an advisory board that no one would think of or whatever could even. It's not a factor in anybody's thinking about. And this is an important body, but they have the power to make such a
it
incredible decision that basically
absolutely.
makes government financial accounting non-transparent. And so the change that you're talking about, I think it was FASB 56 was the particular recommendation or the I
Standard
don't
56, yeah.
yeah. So before then there were disappearing trillions into a secret parallel financial system. Basically, that's how Catherine Austin fits. And they were attempting to disguise it through these adjustments. Then after FASB 56, they're no longer even attempting to disguise it. They're just saying we're just not going to report it anymore. We're going to do
Right.
this, but we're basically not even going to go through the steps
Institutionalized,
to try to
yeah,
disguise this.
institutionalized opacity. Before, I think people were trying to do their jobs and they noted all of these discrepancies and it was summarized and you could see it. Nobody really followed it all that much. Every once in a while it pop up in a report or in the media, but it was sort of glossed over. It was sort of like, oh, these guys are just incompetent. We don't have very good systems, and then, but it's
Right.
no big deal. And Catherine said, no, it's a big deal. This can't happen. This shouldn't happen. It can't happen. And I totally agree. It can't happen. And so now with Standard 56, we've just through an administrative decree. It didn't go through Congress. There was no change. It's not constitutional in any way. The Constitution clearly says that we need to have a clear accounting of the money that comes in and the money that goes out. And now we don't have that. It looks like we have it. We have a report that comes out and we have a financial statement, but we know through Standard 56 that they've given themselves the authority by administrative decree to make any kind of modification and hide whatever it is that they think is a national security issue.
Right.
So It's not
Okay.
consistent. It's not consistent with the, a democratic republic
Right.
kind of system. It's just flat out not that.
Is there any way we can try to help us get a sense of scale for how much trillions and trillions of dollars is? I mean, like what imagine if that money had been used into the economy or into society versus what could it possibly, what kinds of scales of things, of activities could you fund with this kind of money?
Well, India is an emerging country. It is very dynamic, has 1 billion people that they have to feed and clothe and house. They have emerging cities. It in 2000, about 2023, its GDP was about 2.1 trillion. So they're feeding, clothing, housing, cars, funding infrastructure, 2.1 trillion.
Hmm.
So that gives you some context. Now we don't know, like a lot of these transactions. Well, first of all, we only have a smattering of reports, right? Because they don't do, the Army comes out every several years, and they might do the Navy in the next year over this, dating back to about 1998. So we only have smattering of reports, and then we summarized it all. But within any one report, there might be a flow in of some X amount and a flow out of X amount. For example, there is one adjustment for Treasury. There was a fund balance shift from Treasury to the Army of nearly $800 billion. So how does a Treasury, you know, shift that kind of money over? The Army's budget is just a fraction of $800 billion, but it looks like, according to this discrepancy, that 800 billion adjustment was made. Well, what's that for? So there's this money flowing into the Army, but then there's an expenditure going out for a variety of purposes. And so that's like an example. So when we talk about 21 trillion of unaccounted for transactions, sometimes it might be money flowing in and then money flowing out.
Hmm.
Sometimes it might be within the unit itself. So we don't really know how big it is, or how, it's it's just a big mass of chaos, in my opinion.
Right. So
But
it, yeah.
let me say one other thing, and then you can ask a question. So as of 2018, there was a change that reduced the transparency of government. It wasn't very transparent before, but now it's institutionalized, and we can't see this flow of money going from the government, let's say, to a contractor,
Right.
right? But on the other side of it, dating back a number of years, I'm going to look at my notes. I think it occurred in first Bush administration that gave, through the Security and Exchange Commission, the authority of certain companies to not report fully its financial statements. So that has been in the case for, decades, that
Hmm.
the authority can be given to conceal certain types of activities within corporations and businesses.
Hmm.
So now we have the federal government with potential flows that we can't see clearly. And then on the other side of it, we have non-transparent reporting of public entities.
Hmm.
So you talked about sort of a secondary financial system. We have, through these lack of transparency, a flow of funds happening that we can't see, and we don't know how big it is.
Right. Now, is this system that you're talking about with this federal accounting fraud, this seems to be bypassing Wall Street, and the transactions are going directly from Treasury to these government agencies. and it's just like they're just printing the money, not printing it, but they're just making like the money transfer. It's just numbers on a screen, basically, right? That they're
Yeah,
putting into the
I don't
accounts of
know.
these.
Typically the way any kind of government would have some sort of functioning agency like a treasury that where money comes in and then it gets dispersed according to the legislative body's instructions. So the DoD, Army, Navy will get disbursements from Treasury in order to spend. So what's anomalous about the example that I provided is that that $800 billion transaction is far in excess of authorized spending by Congress. So
Right,
then the question is well, where did they get that money from? I don't know. Or they might say, well, it's not real money. We're just making an adjustment on paper, but there's no way to confirm how could it be so large in a single
right,
year. It doesn't make any sense. The other piece is that the Federal Reserve, which is its own entity, it's not officially a government entity, but it serves the purpose of facilitating all the transactions of federal government.
right.
So if money flows from, let's say, the Army or some other part of the DoD to a contractor, that transaction will go through the Federal Reserve.
Hmm.
So if we wanted to see those transactions, we would have to go to the Federal Reserve. We could go to the Federal Reserve and see the flow of funds.
Hmm.
But again, we're not able to see that.
Right. So taking a step back and looking at this as an economics professor, it must be kind of surreal because this doesn't have to do with anything that is traditional economic theory. We're not really dealing with a normal pattern of economics. It doesn't seem like bankers even are really behind this. This seems like a think tank. This seems like something that like we're seeing the effect of the national security state moving into the financial system and engineering systems rather than the traditional mindset of economic thinking. This is much more advanced, I would say. But what is your impression of what we're encountering here? This is not. Is there any kind of system of economics? It may not be in the public light, but is there any kind of way of thinking about this economically that you could maybe
Yeah,
empathize with what they might be doing here?
I think, are you familiar with a term called regulatory capture?
Yeah.
Yeah, so George Stigler won a Nobel Prize for this work, but the idea was that for any government or government regulatory body, it's possible that it can become captured by certain interests because those private interests have a concentration of power and they can unduly influence the regulatory body or the agency to favor the choices that they get that are made, and that at times comes at the expense of the original intent, which was to benefit the citizens.
Hmm.
And so that's an economic idea, and I think what's happening in this case is that I think that many many, if not all, elements of our federal government are largely captured,
Hmm.
including the DoD and including the Treasury. I don't make a distinction between the military industrial complex and the financial sector. I,
Right.
I think they're one and the same. The only way we can have a dollar system that dominates globally is because we have a strong military.
Right.
And so what happens in the financial industry is, very closely linked to military strength and
Hmm.
the decisions that are made there. So I think they go together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people overlook what happened during the 40 years of the Cold War because the logic of the arms race and of this existential battle against the Soviets, it justified the military industrial complex or the national security state moving into every sector of society and basically consolidating. So the Cold War, I think, was the birth of the system, or it provided the cover for the build out of the system that you and
Yeah.
Catherine Fitz later uncovered.
I think I would agree with that.
So the next place I wanted to go with this, I think might unravel some of the mystery about where the money's being funneled to. And that has to do with the synchronicity that occurred around the time when you were publishing your research to Catherine Fitz around, I think 2017 it was. This was also the time when the New York Times and major media outlets started to talk about their acknowledgement of the UFO issue. And
Mm,
that's part of this story I've been developing. Now, let's set aside the question of extraterrestrials or aliens, because I have an argument in my book I present against that. I think that this phenomenon is better explained alternatively, but this does seem to be the pairing here, where we have trillions of missing money and a clearly attempt with FASB 56 around 2017 to not reform the system that you guys are uncovering, but rather to protect it and advance it even further. And then we have the revelation that not only do UFOs exist, but the government has some secret history, has some interest in them going back for decades. So is this really the pairing that we're looking at? I want to go deeper into this, but is this what you see?
well, I mean, those are tough questions. I mean, we can try to dig up as much as we can about UFOs and hidden technology, underground bases. I clearly we do have a number of underground bases, but we don't know how extensive that network is.
Right,
But we can certainly point to a number of them that we know about, but it might be much more extensive than we understand it to be. And undoubtedly, I think, in my mind anyway, there are technologies that are hidden, that are not available for most of us.
right,
So the question is how much does it cost to produce all of that? And where did the money come from? Did it, we do have a black budget within, say, the DoD, spending. So there's a part of that overall approved budget that we can't really see what's in there. But this missing money in the accounting transactions that can't be, that's different than that black budget. So could all of the stuff that's happening underground or the technology, the UFOs, that again, we have so little information, so
right.
we're sort of speculating, that we're forced to. We're supposed to do the best that we can with what we have, and we try to make sense of it all. And so it's important to have a framework and a model, and then you know, be able to assess to some degree. Nowadays there's so much information and misinformation, and some of the real information is called misinformation or disinformation, but it's actually the real thing.
Right.
But increasingly, it's difficult to identify what is real and what is not, in my opinion, and it's only going to get harder with AI. But so I sort of think about some probability distribution nowadays. And so when when there's news or information, I assign some probability that it's true in my own mind. Like, oh, that's
Right.
probably 70% true, maybe, or at least elements have some truth in them. And in my opinion, based on what I know, I think there are underground bases that are far more extensive than what we know of.
Hmm.
I think there is technology that is hidden and available to some, but not to most of us,
Hmm.
with a reasonably high probability. I just
Hmm.
don't know how big or how much.
One of the things I appreciate about Catherine Fitz, and there was a circle of researchers that she kind of put me onto back around that time. Richard Dolan was one of them, and then
Yeah.
Joseph Farrell was one of them. And they take the UFO issue seriously and give a very well researched analysis of it. And particularly Richard Dolan with his UFOs in the National Security State series. And I feel like it's that research, and I cite a bit of that in the book, that for me helps unravel this mystery. And World War II seems like a major point in the emergence of this system. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just after World War II, the founding of the CIA Act of, I think, 1949 and the National Security Act of 1947. I know that Catherine Austin Fitz has talked about this in relation to this issue of the missing trillions, because that seems to be the initial move to create and to disappear large amounts of money in an unaccountable fashion within the military industrial complex and national security state. And so you can see back then the beginnings of a system that could explain what you later encountered 50 years later, 60 years later.
Yeah, first I have a really high level of respect for Joseph Farrell and Richard Dolan, and they're very reasonable, thoughtful people. And so I think they offer compelling information. So for your listeners, I'd encourage them to have a look at those resources. It's very informative.
Hmm.
Regarding the history, I don't feel that I have a deep knowledge here. I know that during that time there were changes made. I think that there was also a lot of sort of war loot that needed to be reallocated and
Right.
handled. And so I think the CIA was involved in all of that. But honestly, I don't feel that I can offer a deep degree of informed opinion about all the layers of the things that happened at that time.
Right. Yeah, the one thing I'll just highlight about that without going into any details, it seems
Yeah,
that,
please.
that's the first time that we can see, and this is something that Fitz and Farrell have both emphasized, is that this is the first time you can really see overtly the national security state moving into finance and economics and starting to influence it directly. So when we go back and look at a larger historical model of America, we see that during the Gilded Age, moving up to the establishment of the Federal Reserve, we really had a type of a quiet coup happen in terms of an oligarchy and a sort of elite banking network rising to political and economic prominence. I mean, that's unarguable that that happened in America during that period. And so that oligarchy
Culminating
really,
with the establishment of the Federal Reserve.
which enthroned this power structure.
Yeah.
And you could look at that point as being the time when America really ceased to be a democratic republic as it was originally designed to be. So I would argue up until World War II, that oligarchy and that financial network was the elite sort of power behind the scenes in America. But I think with what they're talking about with what happened after World War II, that's when the oligarchy was kept in place, but now we have another thing emerging. I conceive it like atop of it. Like if you layer it like a pyramid, now we're looking at another level atop of the oligarchy and their financial networks, and they kept them in place, but now they're through the lens of national security and the Cold War, now they're beginning to take over and guide the direction of this private financial capital. And so I don't see bankers running the world. So at this point, I think at a certain time you could say that. I think the bankers are very powerful and get rewarded handsomely for the role they play in a larger system that I think an invisible world of technocrats, bureaucrats, strategists, think tankers, people like that's who orchestrates the larger motions of society, which I think is best described as an empire.
Yeah, there's a book by Carol Quigley called and Hope, which I think outlines very well and in great
Hmm.
detail what you're talking about. And I think I have a similar model. I don't think of the bankers as being the decision makers. There's a layer that we can't see that has this tremendous influence, and it's if you're the head of a particular country or a state or the head of a large bank, I think at some level you have to answer to yet a higher authority, whoever they are. I
Right.
don't, I agree with Catherine Austin Fitz. I'm not sure who those people are, but you know, as we talked before we started this conversation, we talked a little bit about COVID and whatever happened during COVID. It revealed this large coordinated effort, and all of the storylines, the propaganda, the narratives, the decisions made by government officials all over the world happened in a very coordinated, orchestrated fashion. And I
Hmm.
think that illustrates, either everybody's doing it because it makes sense and everybody's super smart, or they were instructed to do so in a particular way.
Hmm.
And I so much of what happened didn't make any sense. So I tend to go with the view that it was all orchestrated. I think it's clear.
Hmm. There's another piece of this puzzle. I'm not sure if this is something that you're interested in or have spent time looking into, but this is something I appreciate Joseph P. Farrell has spent a lot of time going into. So he's the one who I take this piece from. But he looked at what was going on in Nazi Germany, particularly within the SS, which is like the deep state of the Nazi Party. This is during World War II, especially towards the end of World War II, that within the SS, there was established a very secret, basically weapons technological think tank. And it was named after a guy named Hans Kammler, and it was called the Kammlerstab, which means the Kammler's office. But when I look into the story, which is only now starting to get some more coverage outside of a very small group of people who research this, and I think the existence of this office, it was so secret that it really wasn't even known in the public until around 2000 or 2005 or something like that. But they were doing research into exotic physics during the war, looking for a wonder weapon or something that could turn the tide of the war because they saw it moving against it. So they threw, towards the end of the war, they threw all their resources into this top secret research apparatus. And when you look at the parameters of how this thing worked, it looks in many ways that it was the prototype for like a parallel governance structure specializing in science and technology. Because the Kammlerstab during World War II was using underground bases, using this elaborate mechanism of security and information control around itself, and it was developing a private financial apparatus to run its activities so that it wouldn't be, so that it would be outside of accountability or any prying eyes from even the overt Nazi party. And so I think that after World War II, America came in and basically harvested this program and replicated it at home, supersized it, and that's what we're encountering today with this idea of what Catherine Fisk calls breakaway civilization. I call it the technocratic superstate, but
Yeah.
that's kind of my grand
Um,
thesis about this.
I would love to, if you've got, maybe I need to buy your book.
No, no, I'll send you a copy for sure.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'd love to learn more about this. But in the sense that many influential scientists, not in the Nazi Party and in Germany, after the war, they came here
Yeah,
and they were placed in key positions throughout government
yeah.
and through the scientific arena. So I don't think their idea just went away. I know that that's true. The other pieces I can't speak to, but I look forward to reading your book.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today in this chat, and hope we can keep in contact. I'll definitely send you a copy of the book. What's on the radar for you coming up?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I had a. Are you familiar with any of the work that I did during COVID?
No, but I would like to hear more about it.
In brief, when the COVID vaccines were released and we started to see signals of injuries and COVID vaccine fatalities emerge through the vaccine adverse events reporting system,
Hmm.
I decided to administer a survey to learn about what happened to people due to COVID and the vaccine, and importantly, what happened within their immediate family and friend network.
Hmm.
Because if you were badly injured or you died, you couldn't obviously, tell a story about it. Somebody would have to
Right,
tell that story for you.
right.
So it was very revealing. After the first year of the COVID vaccine, about 20 to 25% of people said they knew at least one person who had been died or received significant injury from the COVID vaccine.
Wow.
And, things like, he was a tremendous athlete getting ready to play in the junior baseball World Series, but then he got a blood clot in his leg and had to have his leg amputated.
Yeah.
Died of a heart attack, had a stroke, that kind of stuff. So I published that. I wrote a paper about it and then published it in a medical journal. And then the shit hit the fan basically because there was a lot of pushback on doctors who had been warning about it, just sort of
Right.
spread it on social media. So it ended up being the top. in terms of its exposure, the top article in the history of the journal. And
Wow.
out of the, I don't know, 39 million articles tracked, maybe in the top 900 or 1,000, and just got so much exposure. Both people who were like, this validates my experience, and people who hate, didn't want that kind of message being out there. So, a long story short, the estimate from the survey was that in the first year, as many as 250,000 people might have died by the COVID vaccine, and more than 1 million with significant harm. And so that got pushed back. The paper was re-reviewed and then retracted from the journal.
Hmm.
And then whoever complained to the journal complained to the university, claiming that I had done something unethical, which then turned into a 7-month investigation. And then at the end of it, they determined that I hadn't actually done anything wrong. But the newspapers and the Chronicle of Higher Ed and all of that, they don't report on that, of course. So, a long story short, I'm sort of recovering from that
Yeah.
and got through it. And I'm doing some additional work with some partners on trying to, help promote good research that helps improve overall health and well-being. I'm thinking about sort of my more traditional kinds of things that don't, people don't get mad about, like funding infrastructure, shrinking cities, challenges, maintaining
Yeah.
quality of life, those
Now,
kinds of
did
things.
you get any pushback for the work you did on the trillions?
Uh, Not too much. People just asked a few questions, and I, I didn't get a lot because I think it was because I was relying solely on official government reports.
Hmm.
And I tried to be really careful about how I said what these mean. And so there wasn't a lot of, there was a lot of exposure and it was a little stressful, but, but I didn't get into any significant amount of trouble, like a retraction. I had an invitation to write a book chapter about it in a book, and so I did that. And then the editors reviewed it and were happy with it and wanted to put it in the book. And then the the book company refused. They said, if you include this chapter, we will not publish your book.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's the closest thing that I got into, you know, some hot water with that,
Right.
just wanting to suppress it to some degree, I think. But with the COVID thing, I stepped on some toes. I felt like I needed to do that, and I knew it was going to be risky. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a very simple ethical question. We, I think we can establish very clearly that the COVID gene therapeutic vaccine was an experimental product.
Right.
The only reason that they were able to administer it all is because it received emergency use authorization, which by definition means it's experimental.
Right.
Is it ethical to mandate a medical intervention of an experimental product? The answer is no.
Right.
And yet most universities mandated it. And I couldn't make any headway in my administration. I tried to push back as much as I could.
Yeah, it was lockstep. It was global lockstep implementation of that
Yeah,
policy.
it was, and it caused tremendous, tremendous damage. And they also suppressed medications that could help
Real.
people.
Because they needed it's interesting looking back on it, you can see all the ways they engineered the death numbers to cause the panic, at least the appearance of the panic, and it's hard to tell what the actual death numbers are, but they needed the appearance of hysteria because that mandated the shot.
Yep,
That's
I
exactly
agree.
how it played out. But then
Well,
beneath
and
the surface, did you look at any of the financials behind it? Because I remember, and I haven't followed up on this, but I remember around 2020, reading, I think Catherine Fitz talked about this and a few other people, how there was basically a covert bailout, maybe even larger than what happened in 2007,
Oh,
8.
absolutely. Yeah, the Federal Reserve, there was a, I think it was in the repo market there, the overnight lending really expanded in the fall before COVID really hit. And so there was a financial crisis that appeared to be brewing. And then when COVID hit, that gave, for lack of a better term, I think it gave cover to engage in massive amounts of spending and money printing.
Hmm.
So embedded in all of that was, I think, a massive support for the financial institutions, which were in trouble again.
Right.
But it's a little hard to unpack it all and try to sort through where the money went, et cetera, because it was all sort of embedded in the COVID narrative, and that we've got to do this because of COVID.
Right.
And we shut everything down. People needed assistance because they were not being allowed to work, and so many different layers of things. So it's at least for me, it's a little hard to sort through how the money was used, but it was trillions of dollars, and
Right.
and and a good amount went through the financial institutions.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but the thing I really didn't expect to happen while we were in all that was for this whole thing to just kind of all of a sudden just kind of fade away. You
Yeah,
know? It's like the Ukraine war started and all of a sudden you didn't have any of this issue anymore. It just kind of went
yeah.
away.
I think sometimes I will get a little, I don't know, criticism or cover for this, but even today, the last time I looked, excess fatalities are higher now than during COVID. So excess fatalities are sort of like that. You have this baseline rate.
Right.
People die at a fairly consistent basis. So, every once in a while, if you have a bad flu season, you might have more fatalities than expected, and
Right.
then it would return, right? And during COVID, we had an uptick, but today's excess fatalities over that baseline is higher than, I think it's still higher than during COVID, and we don't talk about it.
So you're saying the effects are simmering below the surface, but they're revealing themselves in this excess death,
Yeah, I
possibly.
mean, I think my hypothesis is that people are dying at a higher rate because of the COVID shots,
Yeah.
and maybe some from residual COVID or other things. But I think probably the consistent higher excess fatality post 2020 is because of the shots. And I feel, you know, it, unfortunately, I think that's true.
Yeah. I know there's a guy named Dennis Rancourt you might have come across. I think he was analyzing these insurance tables from these insurance companies about this issue of excess deaths, and he estimated 30 million people
Globally.
worldwide. Yeah.
Yeah, I I think it's a little hard to know for sure
Yeah.
globally, but
It's impossible to know because the like you were saying, a lot of people but who got ill from them or had adverse effects weren't reported. And then a lot of the side effects that might be existing now, like I know somebody who was pro-vaccine, got all the vaccines, then got myocarditis, but then she thought that was a side effect of getting COVID because she still got COVID, decided getting the vaccine. So she thinks that she got the myocarditis from COVID versus the shot. So it's like that kind of thing where it's like, who can really tell? No one's able to really keep track of what the actual effects have been and are to this day.
yeah, it's difficult. I know people who are still struggling with pericarditis because of the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's when I take time to think about it, it's overwhelming.
Yeah. And there's no closure. There's been no closure on it. It's just like we're saying, it kind of faded away, and then everything, all the power structures that were behind it remain in place, and it just this unresolved thing that I'm sure will activate it again at some point. I mean, whether they try another pandemic or not, or whether something like that happens again, the
Yeah.
WHO and places like that are trying to predict another one will happen. So we'll see what happens, but
Yeah,
it's
I think as you mentioned in pre-interview, it was kind of a test run for this global decision infrastructure in place to implement, global change at some level. And I think that they'll do it again. I don't know if it'll be a health crisis or something else, but I think you're right.
Hmm.
They were seeing how their systems worked.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks, Alex. Really
All
good
right.
talking.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep.
Take
Bye.
care.